What's up my beautiful mates, it's Uncle Night Shift again. So far the only effects we added to this model are filters, oil dots, washes, and some shadows and highlights. And to be honest, the model looks pretty decent as it is, but of course it wouldn't be my model if it wasn't beaten up like a toy car in a washing machine. I already did a few practice runs on the wheels and the lower hull, which was super easy, and it was actually something like a warm-up lap, and also on this fender. I just needed to figure out the exact ratio of each chipping layer because I'm not quite used to painting camouflages such as this. And I also tried it on the back. I just needed a few more tries before I was happy with the results. So with that out of the way, let's begin. So the first step is the sponge method. I found an old hobby blade handle which can be transformed into a chipping tool by simply pressing a piece of sponge into it. I know, maybe not the most sophisticated thing, but it'll certainly make you feel more artistic and professional. I mixed the light chipping color from 4 drops of German yellow, 3 drops of white, and 1 drop of tap water. This will represent the superficial scrapes in the paint job. And of course it's important to remove most of the paint on a piece of napkin or paper before you start tapping the model with the sponge. Now this is understandably a very efficient method. If you've been following this channel for some time, then you'll know I've always considered this to be more of a secondary technique. What I mean is that so far I didn't consider it to be that important on its own, and the only reason I used it was to get lots of random chips in a short amount of time, which I would then refine and connect with a paintbrush. After all, that's the same thing I'm gonna do in this case. But this time, something changed. Something just felt different. Maybe I just started realizing that if you take your time and put more effort into this step, then you can end up with pretty good chipping and maybe even skip the second step and jump right into the dark steel chipping stage. In the end, this can save you tons of time, which I'm sure is a commodity most of us don't have. One way to improve your sponge chipping is to rotate the sponge or even use different pieces on different parts of the model. This is something I know in theory, but obviously wasn't able to put into practice because it's one of those fleeting thoughts which come out of nowhere once you're done and you're like, oh, I should have done that. Anyway, I think it's appropriate to talk about the elephant in the room, which in this case is the way I'm chipping this model. Obviously, in real life, the first paint to wear down would be the green, or at least in those places where it is. And then the yellow, which would expose the oxide red primer underneath, and only then, if that layer was worn, we would see metal. I'll talk about it in a second, but first let's move on. So the chipping so far looks pretty wild, but let's tame it down with a paintbrush. I'm gonna use the exact same paint mixture, but this time I'll add 2 drops of acrylic paint retarder and 2 drops of tap water. And my favorite chipping brush is this Vallejo Kolinsky 000. So like I said, this step is about connecting and refining those sponge chips, and I think what you see is quite self-explanatory, so let's get back to the elephant. This method of chipping a multiple color camouflage is nothing more than cheating, or no, not cheating, hacking. Because if you know how the process works in real life, you can either replicate it the exact same way, which would be quite difficult in this case, as I decided to paint the green patches by hand, but yes, ultimately it would create the most authentic result. Or if you already know how each color and effect works with each other, you can hack the process and make it more simplified with passable results. I think it's about time to get more specific, so what I mean by all of this is that I basically use this light chipping layer to simulate 2 types of chipping. The first is the chipped green paint, revealing the dark yellow underneath, and the second is the light superficial chipping in the dark yellow itself. Superficial chipping is when something is rubbing or scratching against the paint and it makes it look more dull. I don't know if I'm getting the point across because I'm not very convinced by what I'm saying either, but I'm sure I will make a proper, so to say, chipping on another model at some point in the future. Bottom line is that chipping a paint job like this can get extremely time consuming, and it's not a bad idea to take a few shortcuts if you don't want to spend a month just chipping the model. Anyway, at this point I also painted some light grey chips on the gun barrels, which are painted in a heat-resistant primer. I focused them mainly on the upper surfaces where crew would step over them or just sit on them while they're chilling. Gun barrels are usually boring and bland details, and fine chipping adds tons of texture and detail to them. So with the second stage done, the chipping starts to make a little bit more sense. The most important thing is to focus it around the edges and exposed parts, but also we can't forget about the centers of panels, because the model would like a cartoon drawing with all the edges being outlined. Let's now continue with the steel chipping. I needed a few tries before I came up with this mixture, but essentially it's 4 drops of dark grey, 3 drops of flat brown, and 1 drop of dark yellow to make it contrast less with the paint job. And of course 2 drops of retarder and 1 drop of tap water. The result will be a greyish brown steel color, and the yellow drop is just there to make it less dark and make it look more natural on the dark yellow base coat. And I'm gonna use the same brush as before. So the point of this step is to simulate those places where paint has been completely removed, exposing the steel underneath. I mentioned that German tanks had a layer of red primer underneath, and I want you to keep that in mind for a little longer because we're still hacking our way through the process. By now we all know how this method goes. Fill in most of the previously painted light colored chips and make sure to leave just a faint outline. This multi-layered approach will make them stand out, they'll be clearly visible, and they will look more three-dimensional, as if they were actually going through the paint and not the opposite way. But again, one more specific thing. I found it very important to paint the light colored chips significantly bigger than I usually do. The reason for this is that, and this is just my assumption and observation, not a rule set in stone, you have to make it look like there are more layers of chipping than there actually are. In other words, again, the first paint to chip would be the dark green, and this would be the largest chip. Then you'd have a smaller chip in the dark yellow, and inside of that would be the smallest chip going all the way down to the primer or metal. But here we are only using 2 layers, so the first one is the light one, and now the steel one. From what I've tried, this seems to work just fine, or at least for me, as it gives the illusion of multiple layers of paint being continuously removed. If those light outlines were tiny and tight, it would look as if the green and yellow were individually painted straight onto the metal. Yeah, I think that's the best explanation. Or, I don't know, is it? Anyway, despite the huge amount of chipping, the effect doesn't seem overwhelming at all. In fact, and again, this is just my personal feeling, it looks just right. Yeah, there's the usual discussion if chipping is realistic, because tanks didn't survive that long, but I think I already did enough explaining about my approach to this whole thing in my previous videos. Let's now take an enamel rust zone and get this thing done. And by this thing I just mean the chipping stage, not the entire model of course. So the process is quite straightforward. The first step is to brush the enamel rust on top of the steel chipping. The amount is completely up to you, and I like to place it on the biggest chips and where lots of smaller flakes are concentrated. Then as soon as it's dry to the touch, you can start blending it with enamel thinner, or in this case white spirit, which is also a type of enamel thinner, but it's more special somehow. Even though this is much faster than the previous steps, it still takes some time and patience. The most important thing is to not overdo the amount and focus it only around the chips. Then, if you look at it as a whole, it doesn't look that harsh, and it actually blends the previous chipping layers together. And this is our final hack in this process. I already mentioned how these faint rust tones blend the light and dark chips together. That's the reason why I consider this style of chipping as one big technique, which consists of multiple smaller techniques. In this case, the light chipping, dark chipping, and rust tones. Again, the realism here is questionable, and you can discuss it in the comment section all day long, but I found my inner peace many years ago, and I'm perfectly okay with sacrificing some realism for a more detailed and interesting paint job. But okay, so where's the hack? Well, like I said, German tanks were first covered in a layer of oxide red primer, and only then they were painted with dark yellow or dark grey or whatever. Considering how small the model is and how small the chipping is, it would be nothing short of ridiculous to paint that many layers of different chips. This is where the rust wash comes in handy, because when you combine it with the dark grey chipping, the resulting surface actually resembles the oxide red primer. So the effect we're creating actually represents both types of chipping, the oxide primer and steel. Of course, this is just an illusion, and if I need to explain it and point it out, then it's probably not the best illusion, but I tried, there was some effort. Needless to say, the last thing we're chipping is the weld detail. Weld beads usually don't corrode as fast, or at all, so I will use an ordinary silver acrylic paint from Tamiya. Here it's important to chip only those weld beads that are surrounded by large amounts of chipping. Most of the time you'll see exposed weld beads on horizontal surfaces where crew often walks around. If you've seen the construction video, then you know I made all of those weld beads from a two-part putty, so this technique definitely makes them shine. Because they're shiny, and it makes them shine, like stand out. I also made a very detailed video about this method, so if you want to learn more, make sure to check it out. Because the silver paint is often too strong, you can take an enamel wash, in this case the same wash I used in the previous episode, and gently let it flow into the weld bead. This will both emphasize its texture and also tone down the shiny paint. And it can also partially fix and hide any accidental mistakes. And that's it for tonight, my friends. It's quite interesting how involved the chipping process can be, even on a tiny model like this one. Funny thing is that I often found myself approaching it as if this was a 1/48 or even 1/72 scale model, always trying to make it super tiny, but yeah, overall it was quite fun. And as usual, I think this technique made the model pop. Like, now we're finally in business. The only thing preventing us from the actual weathering, aka dust and mud, are all those tiny details like the engineering tools and the exhaust, periscopes, antenna mount, and the convoy light. And of course the rubber cladding on the wheels. To be honest, that's quite a lot of details, and some of them, especially the tools and exhaust, are gonna be quite interesting in terms of painting and all the techniques required to make them look nice. So I decided to make all of that into its own video. And I also need to make a quick video to keep ahead of the upload schedule, but it's mainly because the techniques are interesting. And of course a shout out and big thank you to my patrons. If you'd like to get access behind the scenes and get almost daily updates and also access to early videos, for example, if you were my top tier patron, you'd already be watching the next video about those small details. So if that's something you'd be interested in, just check it out. Anyway, now I'm gonna leave you, my friends, because that's all I wanted to tell you tonight. Thank you all for watching, I wish you an awesome weekend, and I'll see you mates in the next one. And here are some bloopers. If you've been following this channel for some time, then you'll know I've always considered this to be... Or if you already know how each color and effect works with each... I think it's what... I don't know if I'm getting the point across because I'm not very convinced by what I'm saying. And of course a shout out to... And of course...